More than 500 years ago, families made their livings from the land to the north of you. They lived in longhouses, worked in fields, and operated tin works in the valley bottom. Their livestock grazed on the hilltop commons. At the crest of the steep side of the Phoebe Valley, archaeologists have studied the ruins of their two medieval farming hamlets. The hamlets were probably called Tresibbet. This Cornish name was recorded in the late 14th century, and people may have known the two by names like North and South Tresibbet, or Higher and Lower Tresibbet. Documentation is sparse. All we know about those who lived in the hamlets comes from the archaeological survey. This film contains a reconstruction of their world. On its crisp winter's day, the vegetation is low, so the detail of the settlements and fields is clear. Each hamlet contained two farmsteads, and at the heart of each farmstead stood a longhouse. This substantial and well-built single-storied building had a weather-tight thatched roof. The people who lived in these houses shared their homes with their best cattle. Doorways placed roughly centrally on each long side created a cross passage. People lived in the uphill part and their cattle were stalled in the lower part. Cattle were smaller then and 2 rows could be accommodated. Mangers were built against the side walls and there was a central drain. The cross passage created a through draft that was used to winnow threshed grain. It could also be used to adjust the air reaching the turf fire in the centre of the main living room. Its smoke escaped through a hole in the ridge of the roof. Longhouses had private inner rooms at their uphill ends. People probably slept in the lofts over these rooms and over the cattle. While longhouses may seem primitive to us, they were beautifully built and carefully finished. They were the typical form of farmhouse in most pastoral areas of Britain in the Middle Ages. Visitors would have felt at ease when entering one. Besides the main longhouse, each farmstead had outhouses. These probably accommodated other livestock, like calves and ponies. There were also yards and small gardens. Enclosures called moes contained the household's ricks. Here, bulky material crucial for sustaining life through the winter was stored. In the corn rick, oats were stacked with the ears inwards. The hay rick contained the winter food for cattle and ponies. In the fern rick was cut bracken, providing bedding for the livestock. The turf rick contained blocks of dried peat, the basic fuel for the household fire, and in the furze rick was cut gorse, used for the quick heat needed for some cooking. People lived communal, cooperative and sociable lives in the hamlets. They shared some resources. These included the water supply, natural springs a short way up from each hamlet. The land was shared equitably. Each hamlet had fields subdivided into strips by low grassy banks. The southern hamlet's occupants were preoccupied with accuracy and equality. It has especially regular arrangements. This hamlet was also established on clear ground. It was thus unencumbered by having to accommodate any pre-existing features. The positioning of buildings and enclosures is rigidly rectilinear. They are either parallel or perpendicular to each other. The widths of its strips were especially carefully measured. They used the old Cornish rod, a standard measure, 18 feet long. Our survey located a surviving patch of strips where each was exactly 1 rod wide. Each strip would have belonged to one of the hamlet's 2 households. Close to the hamlet and beyond the arable fields were meadows with the best grass. This was cut for hay in the early summer. The northern hamlet was placed amongst remains of Bronze Age roundhouses. The more irregular, curvilinear prehistoric fields were incorporated into the medieval patterns of strip fields. Medieval longhouses and outhouses here were more organically tucked into spaces than in the southern hamlet. The strips of both hamlets were cultivated using lazy beds. These narrow ridges were made using spades and Cornish shovels rather than by plough. Grain crops were probably oats sown in the early spring. The two households in the northern hamlet shared a slate-roofed corn-drying barn. The land is marginal, and they may have often harvested crops that were unripe. Corn dryers gently warmed and ripened the grain so that it could be ground for flour and meal. Each farmstead within a hamlet was a self-contained economic unit. The cattle in the lower part of the longhouse was theirs, and the harvested material in the ricks was also theirs. Each hamlet had its own separate fuel system, but they seem to have shared some things between each other. A building halfway between the two hamlets may have also been shared. It could have housed a bull used by all the farmers. They also shared the rough grazing on the common on the rounded hill above. This was later called Shepherd's Hill. Here the shallow peat, called turf, was dug for domestic fuel. The members of the household earned money as well. A principal source of this in the medieval period was tin. There are remains of tin streamworks alongside the River Foy in the valley bottom. Large spoil heaps are arranged around pits and water channels. Tresibbet was not a solitary settlement. Archaeological remains of other farming hamlets survive nearby at Carneglos, Goodaver and Higher Langdon. Eventually the hamlets were abandoned, perhaps as the economy changed. In the 17th or 18th centuries, people returned. A small farmhouse was built within the shell of the northern longhouse at Tresibbet. A new pattern of fields with Cornish hedges was created on top of the old strip fields. In turn, this new farm was also abandoned before the 19th century. Ever since then, the land has been farmed quite lightly. This has allowed the ruins left by those earlier farmers to survive for us to see and appreciate.